Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
You know what really sucks? Spending half your life racking up straight A's, pulling double shifts just to get by, juggling work and night classes, passing up vacations, dates, and even decent sleep because you believed deep down that your hard work would eventually earn you the respect of the people who raised you. And instead, you end up sitting across from your parents at some overpriced brunch spot, watching their eyes light up like it's Christmas morning while they whisper about putting a down payment on a luxury apartment for your younger brother, all because he landed his very first job. I wasn't supposed to hear that part. They didn't know I was already seated when they walked in. I'd gotten there early, like always, because being punctual was something they used to pretend to value in me. So I was sitting there at our usual booth, hidden a bit behind the half wall that separated the bar area, sipping my black coffee and reading emails when I heard my mother's voice. "So I was thinking," she said, with that syrupy tone she saves for when she wants to feel generous. "What if we surprise him? He's finally getting his act together. Maybe it's time he had his own place. Something nice." That unit near the river just opened up. I froze. Not because it was shocking that they were spoiling him again. I'd practically grown up watching him fumble through life while being constantly showered with second chances and pats on the back. But because I couldn't believe they were actually going to buy him a whole apartment. This was the same woman who called me irresponsible for buying a car after 10 years of public transit. The same dad who sighed dramatically when I asked for help with my first apartment deposit after grad school. I sat through that breakfast with a polite smile and a hollow chest. I nodded when they bragged about how my brother Josh had finally matured and figured it all out, as if he hadn't dropped out of college twice, totaled 2 cars, and quit more jobs than I could count. When they asked me what was new with work, I gave them the short version. I didn't mention the award I'd received last month from my company, or the fact that my team's latest project had landed us national press. They wouldn't have cared. They would have said something like, "Wow, that's great," and then gone right back to talking about what kind of granite countertops Josh might like. That night, sitting alone in my small but immaculately tidy apartment, the one I pay for entirely by myself, I opened a spreadsheet I'd been keeping for over a decade. It was my quiet little habit. Every time I covered a bill for my parents or helped them out, just until next month, I made a note of it. From age 23 to 36, I'd transferred money for their car repairs, dental emergencies, utilities when they were behind, and even groceries during the tougher months. It added up. In total, I'd given them just under $84,000. Not once had they asked Josh to chip in. You might ask why I did it for so long, why I didn't just say no. The truth is, I was conditioned to believe it was my duty, the reliable one, the good daughter. My parents loved using that phrase, but not in a way that felt like praise. It was more like a leash. Being the good daughter meant showing up, fixing problems, not making waves. Meanwhile, Josh was the dreamer, the artist, the one who just needed a little more time to find himself. I was stability, and he was potential. That's why it hit me differently that morning. I realized I was being used, not just financially, but emotionally. I was the backup plan, the insurance policy, the default safety net. And when I wasn't actively saving them, I was invisible. That realization cracked something inside me, but not in a loud, dramatic way. It was quiet, like the sound of ice melting. A week later, I made a decision. I didn't tell them, I just stopped. No more automatic payments. No more Venmo transfers. No more helping just this once. When my mother called to say the gas bill was unusually high, I told her I was reviewing my budget and would need to prioritize some personal savings goals. She paused, said, "Oh," and hung up. 2 days later, my dad texted, asking if I could float them just 1 car payment. I ignored it. That's when the emails started. Passive-aggressive ones, guilt-trippy ones, then straight-up accusatory ones. But I didn't budge. I told myself I'd give them 30 days. 30 days without their crutch. I wanted to see if they would finally look at me and see a person, not a paycheck. But something else happened instead. Something I didn't expect. Something way darker. Because on day 29, I came home from work to find a letter taped to my front door. My name was spelled in that messy, all-caps handwriting my dad uses when he's furious. Inside was a list, a literal printed list, of every sacrifice they had made for me over the years, including, bizarrely, the cost of giving birth to me. At the bottom, written in Sharpie, "It's your turn to pay it back, starting now." And just like that, the game changed. It's strange how the human mind can carry decades of resentment in silence, pressing it down layer by layer like sediment in the bottom of a river, until one day, the weight shifts just enough to stir up all that muck in a sudden choking current. That letter taped to my door, that ridiculous, smugly itemized list of grievances my parents had apparently been harboring, was the moment the current broke loose. I must have read it a dozen times, each time thinking maybe I'd misread a word or misunderstood the tone. But no, there it was in black ink and bold underlines, spelling out how my very existence had apparently been some long, drawn-out debt they were now expecting me to repay like some kind of ungrateful tenant behind on her rent. And the most disturbing part wasn't even the absurdity of it. It was how clinical, how emotionally detached the whole thing was. Like they'd finally dropped the pretense and started treating me exactly how they'd always seen me, as an asset, an investment they were done waiting on to appreciate. For a few days, I didn't say anything. I went to work, responded to emails, handled meetings, and pretended like I wasn't mentally replaying every moment of my childhood where I'd accepted their words as love when they were just strategy. I remembered all the times they'd told me how proud they were that I didn't need much, how I always figured things out, and how Josh was just different, more sensitive, more fragile. Terms they used as excuses to excuse everything. Every mistake he made, every time he disappeared with no explanation and came back to a warm welcome, was because he was simply wired differently. Meanwhile, I was the rock, the smart one, the one they didn't have to worry about, and yet somehow I was the one left worrying about everyone else. But by the end of that week, something in me hardened. I didn't cry, I didn't call them, I didn't even rant about it to my friends like I used to do after one of my mom's famous backhanded compliments. Instead, I sat down at my kitchen table with a glass of wine, and I made a list of my own, not a petty, childish list like theirs, but a detailed account of everything I'd paid, covered, and handled over the years. I itemized it by year, category, and amount, complete with bank statement references. Then I printed out that spreadsheet, tucked it into a folder, and dropped it in the mail with a note that read, "Consider this your invoice. You can deduct it from whatever you think I owe you." 3 days later, my phone rang. It was my mom. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. Then my dad texted me, something cold and clipped. "Is this really how you want to play things?" I still didn't answer. I wasn't playing. I was done being played. And if that meant they had to sit in their own discomfort for a while, so be it. What I didn't expect, though, was just how quickly things spiraled after that. Within a week, they'd tried 3 different tactics to rope me back in. First came guilt. A long, teary voicemail from my mother about how they were just trying their best and how parents make mistakes too, followed by a vague suggestion that I was ruining the family. Then came anger, a furious email from my dad titled, "Entitlement," accusing me of being selfish, ungrateful, and delusional for thinking they owed me anything. And when those didn't work, they pivoted to manipulation. Josh, of all people, suddenly started texting me after months of silence. At first, his messages were short and friendly, asking how work was, if I'd seen the latest episode of a show we used to watch. I ignored the first few, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I knew where it was headed. And sure enough, after a couple of days, the mask slipped. He asked if I could spot him a little cash, just to tide him over until his next paycheck, he said. Nothing major. I laughed out loud in my apartment, not because it was funny, but because it was so utterly predictable, I didn't even answer. I just blocked his number. But blocking them wasn't enough. They weren't going to let go that easily. What came next was so absurd, so beyond the realm of rational behavior, that it almost felt like satire. My mother, bless her emotionally manipulative heart, went to the lengths of calling my HR department. She claimed she needed to confirm employment details for a family emergency, and when that didn't work, she left a message saying she believed I was having a mental breakdown and might be a danger to myself. I only found out because my manager called me into her office, looking confused and a little concerned, asking if everything was okay at home. I was mortified, not because of the concern, she was kind, thankfully, but because my own mother had tried to weaponize my job against me. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with simple disappointment or even resentment. I was dealing with entitlement wrapped in delusion, an entire belief system that had never seen me as my own person. And the worst part? They truly believed they were in the right. That night, I deleted every shared account. I removed myself from the emergency contacts at their doctor's offices. I canceled the joint credit card that only I had ever paid off. I changed the locks on my apartment, even though they technically never had a key. But I wasn't taking chances. And then, for the first time in years, I slept deeply. Of course, that peace didn't last, because 2 days later, I woke up to find someone had broken into my garage. Nothing stolen, but all my storage boxes were opened, rifled through, like someone had been searching for something specific. And that was when I realized I wasn't just being guilted or manipulated anymore. They were escalating. There's something oddly empowering about realizing that the people you've spent your entire life trying to please no longer hold any real power over you. And while that clarity doesn't come wrapped in satisfaction or immediate peace, it does carry with it a quiet kind of liberation, one that slowly, almost imperceptibly, begins to reshape how you walk through the world. After the garage incident, I didn't panic the way I might have in the past, didn't run to them demanding answers or try to rationalize it as some misunderstanding. Instead, I stood there in the dim light of my motion sensor lamp, staring at the flung open plastic totes that held old high school trophies, faded photo albums, and boxes of tax documents. And I felt this eerie, calm certainty. They were looking for something, and whatever it was, it had nothing to do with sentiment. I took the next day off work, not because I was scared, but because I needed to think, alone, clearly, without their noise cluttering my thoughts. I called a locksmith again, this time to reinforce the garage, and then I sat down and went over every possible document or asset they might believe I had access to. There wasn't much, honestly. I was careful with my finances, kept most of my paperwork digital, protected by passwords and two-factor authentication. But it wasn't about the contents of those boxes. It was about control. They had begun to unravel the moment I stopped playing the part they'd written for me, and now they were lashing out like people drowning in the consequences of their own delusions, clawing at whatever pieces of my life they could reach in a last-ditch effort to reassert dominance. That's when I decided I was done being reactive. If they wanted a war, fine, but I'd fight it my way. Not with screaming matches or dramatic ultimatums, but with silence, with strategy, with the slow, steady unraveling of every illusion they'd wrapped themselves in. I wasn't going to confront them directly. That would have given them satisfaction, proof that they could still provoke me. No, I wanted them to feel uncertain, off balance, like they were playing a game without knowing the rules anymore. So I began to reinsert myself into their world in the most passive-aggressive way possible. I started with Sunday brunch, our old ritual. I showed up to the restaurant unannounced, alone, sat 2 tables over from where they usually reserved, and made eye contact with my mother the moment she spotted me. I didn't wave, I didn't smile, I just lifted my coffee cup in a silent toast and went back to reading my phone. She looked shaken. Dad too, they didn't come over. I finished my meal, left a generous tip, and walked out without a word. That following week, I sent Josh a housewarming gift. Something obnoxiously practical, like a set of garbage bags and toilet bowl cleaner, shipped anonymously, but with a note inside that read, "Because cleaning up your own mess is long overdue." I knew he'd recognize my handwriting. At first, I wasn't sure it was working. They went quiet, eerily quiet. No texts, no emails, not even a snide voicemail. But then, about 10 days later, I received a long message from a mutual family friend, an old neighbor I hadn't spoken to in over a year. She said she'd run into my parents at the grocery store, and my mother had apparently broken down in the middle of the aisle, crying about how cold and cruel I'd become, and how they had no idea what had gotten into me. Theatrics, plain and simple, staged for sympathy. And what made it all the more absurd was knowing that, in the eyes of everyone who hadn't seen the behind-the-scenes chaos, they probably looked like the victims. But then came the real twist. Josh called me again. I didn't recognize the number, but something in me said to answer. I let it go to voicemail first, listened to the message, and then, against my better judgment, I called him back. This time, his voice was different. Less smug, more careful. He said he wanted to talk, not about money, not about our parents, but about something he thought I should know. I wasn't sure if I believed him, but curiosity has a way of overriding common sense, especially when you've been kept in the dark for so long. We met at a diner, neutral territory. He looked rough, thinner than I remembered, with that same fake smile he used to wear when he was trying to get out of trouble. We sat for a few minutes in awkward silence before he finally leaned forward and said, "They told me to go into your garage. They thought you were hiding something, bank statements maybe, or legal papers. I didn't find anything, but they're obsessed with the idea that you're trying to cut them out of something big." I stared at him, barely blinking. "Cut them out of what?" He shrugged. "I don't know. Mom thinks you've got money stashed somewhere. Dad thinks you're planning to move away and leave them behind. Like for good." I almost laughed. It was so pathetically paranoid, so far from the reality of my simple, straightforward life, that I couldn't even muster anger, just a deep, bone-tired exhaustion. "They already left me behind," I said quietly. "They just didn't notice." But then Josh said something that made my skin crawl. "There's more," he mumbled, glancing around nervously. "They found something, an old letter. I think it's from Grandma. It mentioned a trust." That word hit me like a slap. A trust? I had no idea what he was talking about. My grandmother had passed years ago, and as far as I knew, she left everything to my dad. Or so they'd said. But now, suddenly, there was this new variable, a possible inheritance, a buried family secret. And the sudden escalation in their behavior began to make a disturbing kind of sense. Before I could ask more, Josh stood up, said he had to go, and walked out, leaving behind his half-eaten pancakes and 1,000 unanswered questions. And as I sat there in that booth, alone again, I realized the game wasn't over. It had just started. The concept of a trust, one single word whispered like a match struck in a dark room, hung in my thoughts like smoke that wouldn't clear, and as much as I wanted to write it off as one of Josh's signature vague distractions, some tactic to stir up chaos or draw sympathy, I couldn't stop replaying the way he looked when he said it. His voice low, his eyes darting around the diner like he'd been followed, like he knew something important and hated himself for telling me. I'd always suspected that my family had secrets. They were too calculated, too rehearsed in their narratives. But the idea that something as significant as a hidden inheritance had been deliberately kept from me, possibly rerouted or erased altogether, was the kind of betrayal that made my fingers go cold and my chest buzz with a mix of rage and dread. By the time I got home, I knew what I had to do. I dug out my grandmother's old paperwork, a small folder I hadn't touched since college, stuffed with condolence cards and dusty funeral pamphlets. And sure enough, there it was, her handwritten will, or at least a photocopy of it, tucked inside a floral envelope with my name on it. My stomach flipped as I pulled it out, the paper soft with age, but still legible. It wasn't anything elaborate, just a few lines in her careful cursive, leaving the remainder of my estate, save for sentimental items, to my first granddaughter, Emma, in the hopes she will use it to live a life of independence, integrity, and peace. I stared at that sentence for so long it blurred, not to my father, not to the family, to me specifically. It didn't mention amounts or banks, and it wasn't notarized, which meant it wasn't legally binding on its own, but that didn't make it any less real. My grandmother had meant to leave something for me, something personal, something that my father must have quietly buried after her passing, pocketing or redirecting whatever assets had come with it, and assuming I'd never be the wiser. And until now, I hadn't been. The rage didn't hit all at once. It came in waves, simmering just under my skin, as I made a series of calls, first to the county clerk's office to see if there had ever been an official probate case filed in her name, then to an estate attorney who confirmed what I was already beginning to suspect. It was entirely possible for assets to be quietly transferred, even without formal documentation, especially if the family was close-knit and nobody questioned it. And I never had. I was too young when she died, too trusting of my father's vague answers and my mother's soft reassurances that Grandma just wanted what was best for everyone but me, apparently. That night, I didn't sleep. I wrote and rewrote a letter to my parents, each draft more biting than the last, before finally settling on a simple invitation. I told them I wanted to meet, no details, no threats, just a date, a time, and a place. The house I grew up in. I figured if there was ever going to be a confrontation, it should happen on familiar ground, where the ghosts of our history still clung to the curtains and the chipped countertops, where the lies were born, and where, if I had my way, they would finally die. They arrived together just like I knew they would, dressed in the same carefully curated casual clothes they wore for church events and social appearances. My mother was wearing pearls. My father's jaw was tight. They walked in without speaking, sat down across from me at the old dining table, and waited. The silence stretched for a full minute before I slid the envelope across the table. "This is what Grandma wanted," I said, "and you both knew it." My mother opened it with shaking hands, skimmed the letter, and immediately looked away. My father, predictably, didn't flinch. He read it twice, then placed it back on the table and leaned forward. "It wasn't a legal document," he said flatly, like that was some kind of moral get-out-of-jail-free card. She was confused near the end. She said a lot of things. "She was clear enough to write my name," I snapped, the heat in my voice catching both of them off guard. "She trusted me, and you erased her." My mother's lip trembled. "We didn't erase anything. We made a choice. For the family." "No," I said, the word sharp as glass. "You made a choice for yourselves. You thought I'd be too loyal, too obedient to ask questions. You took everything she left behind and decided I didn't deserve it. For a moment, I thought they might apologize. That maybe, just maybe, I'd get some version of an admission, a crack in the facade. But instead, my father stood up slowly and looked down at me with a calm that chilled me more than any shouting ever could. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said. "You're tearing this family apart over something you weren't even supposed to know about." "Then maybe," I said quietly, "it's time this family was torn apart." He stared at me, his expression unreadable, before turning and walking out the door without another word. My mother hesitated, eyes filled with something that might have been regret, or maybe just fear, before following him. And that was the last time I saw them together. The next day, I received a formal notice in the mail from a lawyer I didn't recognize. My parents were filing a cease and desist, claiming I was defaming them and threatening legal action if I continued spreading misinformation about family finances. That's when I realized this wasn't just about inheritance or money or even favoritism. This was about control, who got to tell the story, who got to decide what counted as truth, and who had the audacity to rewrite the narrative after playing by the rules for so long. And I was just getting started. There's a moment, quiet, nearly imperceptible, when a person finally steps out from behind the version of themselves they've carefully curated for others. And in that space, In that breathless split second where masks fall away and illusions are shattered, what's left is rarely tidy or noble or easy to categorize. After the cease and desist letter arrived, tucked into an envelope marked confidential and stamped with a law firm's logo that I quickly confirmed was nothing more than a retired associate of my father's old company, I knew without a doubt that I'd hit a nerve deep enough to rattle the bones of their carefully constructed story, a story they had spent decades authoring with themselves in the starring roles of long-suffering parents who did their best against impossible odds. And I, the good daughter, was no longer reading from their script. I didn't respond to the letter, of course. Not because I was intimidated, but because I recognized it for exactly what it was. A bluff. An attempt to frighten me back into silence using the same tactic they'd employed my entire life. Make her feel like the problem and she'll fold. But I wasn't folding anymore. Instead, I did the one thing I knew they feared most. I began to dig. I spent hours at the courthouse, poring through dusty public records, scanning every property deed, estate filing, and trust document I could legally access. It took time, too much time, but eventually I found what I was looking for, a filing from nearly 2 decades ago, naming my grandmother as the trustee of a modest real estate holding company that, upon her death, was to be dissolved and its proceeds distributed equally among her legal heirs, which, legally speaking, included me. But here's where it got murky. On the dissolution paperwork, my name had been scratched out and replaced with a handwritten note, initialed by my father, stating that I waived all claims to the estate. No signature from me, no witness, no legal validity, just a quiet redirection of funds. I sat in the courthouse lobby, the files shaking in my hands, and realized the full scope of it. Not only had they stolen from me, but they had fabricated paperwork to cover it up, trusting that I'd never bother to check, never suspect the betrayal could run so deep. It wasn't just theft, it was erasure. They hadn't just taken something material. They had rewritten the past so thoroughly that even my name had been scratched out of history. I left the courthouse feeling a kind of cold that reached deeper than anger, deeper than sadness. It was clarity, it was acceptance, and it was resolve. I called the attorney who had helped me with my grandmother's estate and asked what it would take to bring forward a civil case. Not because I needed the money, but because I needed the truth on record. I wanted documentation. I wanted their names next to mine in a legal dispute they couldn't bury, couldn't rewrite. I wanted the world, or at least the courts, to see the story they'd tried to erase. Word got back to them faster than I expected. Within a week, I received a message, not from their fake lawyer, but from my brother. He asked to meet again, said he had more to tell me. Against my better judgment, I agreed, if only to see how deep the rot had spread. This time, we met at a park bench in daylight, where no accusations could be whispered behind closed doors. He looked worse than before, sunken eyes, jittery hands. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't known the full extent of what they'd done, that he'd found more documents hidden in a box in their garage, things that clearly showed I was meant to inherit part of the estate. He handed me a flash drive. I didn't ask what it contained. I already knew. My family hadn't just lied to me. They'd lied to him too, using both of us as pawns in a game they thought they could control indefinitely. I told him I was filing. He didn't argue. In fact, he nodded quietly and said, "You should." When the legal notice was finally served to my parents, I expected fury, denial, maybe even retaliation. But what I got was silence. Utter, complete silence. No calls, no emails, no confrontations. Just a wall of absence where their noise used to be. And oddly, that silence said more than words ever could. They weren't going to fight this publicly, not because they admitted guilt, but because they feared exposure more than consequence. Their legacy, their image, their precious illusion of family unity mattered more than winning, so they disappeared. The court proceedings dragged on. Depositions were taken, statements were filed. Eventually, a settlement was offered, money more than I expected, accompanied by a gag order. I refused. I told my lawyer I didn't want hush money. I didn't want this swept away. I wanted my name in the record, my grandmother's intentions restored, and the truth, however ugly, preserved in ink and signatures. We settled without silence. The documents became public record. And here's the part people don't tell you about revenge, about justice, about standing up after a lifetime of being quiet. It doesn't feel victorious. It feels like grief. You don't walk away smiling. You walk away heavier, lonelier, but with a strange sense of balance restored, like the scales finally stopped tipping in the wrong direction. I still live in the same apartment. I still work the same job. My life didn't transform overnight, but I sleep now, deeply, without checking the locks twice or wondering when the next guilt trip might arrive. Josh moved out of the apartment they bought him, said he couldn't breathe in there anymore. We don't talk much, but I think in his own way, he understands now. As for my parents, I haven't seen them since the day I confronted them in that kitchen. They never responded to the final court ruling, never apologized, never reached out. Sometimes I wonder if they ever believed the things they told themselves about who I was, or if the lie was always just easier to manage than the truth. Either way, I stopped waiting for the answer. And maybe that's the real revenge. Not proving them wrong, not exposing the lie, but finally choosing to stop needing anything from them at all.